The silence in Auditorium 4B was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, a physical weight that pressed against the chest and made the simple act of breathing feel like a negotiation with the atmosphere itself. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, charged with the static electricity of judgment and the impending violence of critique. I sat there, Marcus, invisible in the way that matters most in these spaces, seen only as a silhouette, a statistic, a body occupying a seat that history suggested wasn't built for me. The wood of the desk under my forearms was cool, worn smooth by decades of elbows belonging to men who didn't look like me, men whose presence here was assumed, not contested. Professor Holloway didn't walk into a room, she invaded it. She arrived with the energy of a natural disaster, a whirlwind of tweed and resentment, carrying the midterm essays as if they were evidence in a trial where we were all already guilty. The sound of that stack of papers hitting the podium echoed like a gunshot, a sharp crack that made the collective spine of the class stiffen. I watched her hands, pale, vein-mapped, trembling slightly not with age but with a simmering perpetual indignation. She believed in the sanctity of the canon, in the rigid architecture of proper English, and she viewed any deviation from her curriculum not as creativity, but as an act of personal disrespect. I had spent 3 nights on that essay, 3 nights dissecting the intersection of urban sociolinguistics and classical rhetoric, pouring my lived experience into the rigid mold she demanded, trying to find a way to make my voice sing without crocking the glass ceiling she kept polishing above our heads. The air smelled of dry erase markers and old dust, the scent of an institution that prided itself on tradition, which is often just a polite word for exclusion. I adjusted my glasses, a nervous tic I developed in my sophomore year, and locked my eyes on the blackboard behind her. I was ready. I had done the reading. I had done the writing. But in this room, preparation was only half the battle. The rest was enduring the theater of her authority, the way she used humiliation as a pedagogical tool, sharpening her wit on our insecurities until we bled ink and apology. She began the lecture not with a greeting, but with an accusation. Her voice was a serrated edge, cutting through the stagnant air. Mediocrity, she spat the word as if it tasted like sour milk, is the disease of this generation. You hand me fragments, you hand me text messages disguised as academic inquiry, you hand me stream of consciousness drivel and expect me to award it a degree. She paced the length of the stage, her heels clicking a rhythm of agitation against the linoleum. I watched her move, analyzing the performance of it all. It was theater. It was a power dynamic made flesh. She needed us to feel small so she could feel large. She needed to dismantle our confidence to validate her own guardianship of the subject. She talked about the degradation of language, a phrase that always made the hair on the back of my neck stand up because I knew what it really meant. It was code. It was a dog whistle blown at a frequency that only those of us who had to code switch to survive could hear. It meant that our dialects, our rhythms, the cadence of our grandmothers, and the poetry of our blocks had no place in the ivory tower. I kept my face neutral, a mask of attentive deference, while my mind raced. I thought about the words I had chosen for my paper, the specific weight of them. I had written about the polyrhythms of jazz as a structural framework for essay writing. I had dared to suggest that chaos could be disciplined, that the vernacular was not a corruption of English, but an evolution of it. As she railed against the laziness of modern students, I felt a burning in my chest, not of shame, but of defiance. She was talking about standards, but she was enforcing conformity. There is a difference. Standards raise the bar. Conformity lowers the ceiling. She stopped pacing and turned to the stock of papers, her hand hovering over them like a hawk selecting prey. The room held its breath. We all knew what was coming. The public shaming, her favorite ritual. She would pick the worst paper, or the most daring one, and dissect it live, without anonymity, stripping the author bare before their peers. It was cruel. It was unnecessary. And it was starting right now.
When her hand dove into the pile, I knew. Call it intuition, call it the hyper-awareness of the marginalized, but I felt the shift in the room's energy the moment her fingers grazed the staple of my essay. It was distinct. I used a slightly heavier bond paper, a tactile choice I made because I wanted the words to have physical weight, and I saw the way the page drooped slightly in her grip. She pulled it out with a flourish, holding it up to the light as if inspecting a counterfeit bill. "And then," she announced, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that carried to the back row, "we have this." She didn't say this essay or this attempt, just this, as if it were an object of contamination. "I want to talk about audacity," she continued, walking slowly toward the front row, waving my work in the air. "The audacity to think that the rules of grammar are suggestions. The audacity to prioritize feeling over structure." She sneered at the word feeling. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that seemed loud enough to rival her voice. I kept my eyes fixed on her, refusing to look down, refusing to grant her the satisfaction of seeing me cower. She hadn't read the name yet. She never did at the start. She liked the mystery of it, the way every student in the room sweated, wondering if it was their slaughter she was preparing. She flipped to the second page, scanning the text with a look of exaggerated confusion. "Listen to this syntax," she said, preparing to read. "It defies logic. It wanders. It is undisciplined." That word again, undisciplined. It was a word often thrown at bodies like mine, minds like mine. It was a word that carried the weight of history, of whips and chains and correction facilities. She saw a lack of discipline. I saw a freedom from rigidity. She saw a broken sentence. I saw a sentence that was bending to accommodate a truth too large for subject, verb, object. I tightened my grip on my pen until my knuckles turned ash gray. "Read it," I thought. "Just read the words." She began to read, and her voice was a caricature. She adopted a tone that was mocking, stripping the rhythm from my sentences and replacing it with a stilted, halting delivery designed to make the prose sound incompetent. "The concrete does not weep," she read, pausing for dramatic effect. "It remembers. It holds the heat of the day long after the sun has set, a memory of fire in a cold world." She looked up over her reading glasses, scanning the room for the laughter she expected. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the front row, sycophants desperate to be on the safe side of her wrath. "The concrete remembers," she repeated, dripping with sarcasm. Is this an anthropology paper? Is this poetry? Because it certainly isn't an analytical essay on Victorian literature. She went back to the text. "We navigate these streets like cartographers of the invisible, mapping safe passage through the gaze of those who do not see us." She stopped again. "Who is we?" she demanded of the room. "Who is this collective voice assuming authority? In academic writing, we avoid the ambiguous collective. We demand precision. This is not precision. This is emotional manipulation disguised as intellect." Every word she spoke felt like a physical blow, but strangely, as she continued to read, the mockery began to lose its edge. The words, even in her hostile voice, held their ground. They were durable. I had built them to withstand this. I had written them in the library at 2 a.m., listening to Coltrane, thinking about my father, thinking about the way silence functions as a language in my house. She was trying to tear it down, but the architecture of the thought was sound. She criticized the vocabulary, calling it pretentious in one breath and colloquial in the next, unable to decide which angle of attack was more effective. She was struggling with the hybridity of the text, the way it refused to sit in the box she had designated for it. I watched her frustration mount. She wanted a mess she could clean up. Instead, she found a structure she couldn't recognize, and it infuriated her. Then the shift happened. It was subtle at first, a change in the frequency of the room. She read a passage I had written, Duality of Identity, about the double consciousness that Du Bois spoke of, but framed through the lens of modern surveillance. "To be watched is not to be seen," she read, and for a split second, she forgot to mock it. Her voice leveled out. "To be watched is to be catalogued. To be seen is to be understood."
The tragedy of the canon is that it watches everything and sees nothing. The silence in the room changed texture. It was no longer the silence of fear, it was the silence of listening. The other students, the ones who had laughed nervously moments before, were now leaning forward. The words were doing the work. They were bypassing her filter and landing directly in the minds of the audience. I saw a girl in the third row, a quiet student who never spoke, looking at the professor with wide eyes, absorbing the rhythm of the argument. Professor Holloway faltered. She stumbled over a sentence, not because it was poorly written, but because it was complex, dense with meaning that required her to actually engage with it rather than dismiss it. She hated that. She hated being made to work by a student. She stopped reading abruptly, realizing she was losing the room. She was losing the narrative. The text was seducing the class, pulling them into a world she couldn't control. She needed to regain dominance. She needed to break the spell. She lowered the paper, her face flushing a blotchy red. "It is stylistic overindulgence," she declared, though her voice lacked the previous bite. "It attempts to sound profound by being vague. It mimics intellect without doing the heavy lifting of citation." She was scrambling now, grasping for her usual weapons, but they were sliding off the surface of the essay. The truth of the writing was self-evident. She had tried to expose it as trash, and in doing so, she had accidentally exposed it as art. I felt a surge of vindication, cold and sharp. She couldn't kill it. She could yell at it, she could mock it, but she couldn't kill it. I stood up. The sound of my chair sliding back against the floor was a declaration of war. I didn't rush. I unfolded my frame slowly, rising until I was standing at my full height, towering over the seated students, changing the geography of the room. Professor Holloway gripped the podium, her knuckles white. She looked like she wanted to order me to sit down, but the words stuck in her throat. The dynamic had inverted. She was no longer the predator. She was the one being examined. "Dr. Holloway," I said. My voice was steady, dropping an octave, resonating from the chest. It wasn't the voice of a student asking permission. It was the voice of a scholar defending a thesis. "You asked about the collective voice. You asked who we is." I paused, letting the question hang in the air. "The we is the lineage of oral tradition that predates the Victorian structures you idolize. The we is the complexity of a survivalist dialect that communicates urgency and emotion with a precision that standard English often lacks." I stepped out of the row, moving to the aisle. "You called it undisciplined. I call it polyphonic. You called it vague. I call it nuanced. If the text made you uncomfortable, perhaps the failure isn't in the writing, but in the reader's inability to translate an experience outside of their own limited scope." The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the electricity in the walls. I wasn't shouting. I didn't need to. The truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. It just needs to be spoken. I saw the color drain from her face. She opened her mouth to interrupt, to scold, to reassert her dominance, but she had nothing. She had mocked the text, and I had just provided the footnotes. I had exposed her bias not by calling her a racist, which would have allowed her to play the victim, but by outthinking her. I had proven that the text was intentional, that every error she found was a deliberate architectural choice. I stood there, a black man in a white room, holding the floor, and for the first time in that semester, the room belonged to me. The bell rang, a shrill mechanical scream that shattered the tableau. It was the only thing that could have saved her. The spell broke and the room exploded into the chaotic noise of zippers, shuffling feet, and murmurs. But it wasn't the usual rush to escape. There was a hesitation. Students were moving slower, their eyes darting between me and the professor. They had witnessed a murder, the murder of an ego. Professor Holloway didn't dismiss the class. She simply stopped existing as the authority figure. She gathered her papers with frantic, jerky movements, shoving my essay into her bag as if it were radioactive material she needed to contain. She refused to look at me. She refused to look at anyone. She had been stripped of her armor. The standards she hid behind had been revealed as nothing more than preferences, and her critique had been revealed as prejudice. I took my time. I closed my notebook with a soft snap. I capped my pen. I slid my laptop into my bag. I felt a hand on my shoulder. A guy from the back row, a white student I had never spoken to. He didn't say anything, just gave me a nod, a tight, respectful acknowledgement of what had just happened. It was a recognition of the weight I had just lifted. I walked down the stairs, past the podium. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. Her silence was my victory. The air in the room felt different now, lighter, breathable. The ghost of the lecture hall, the spirit of exclusion that haunted the rafters, had been exorcised, at least for today. I walked out the double doors, the heavy wood swinging shut behind me, leaving her alone in the empty theater of her own making. The sunlight hit me like a physical embrace. It was blindingly bright, washing away the sterile fluorescence of Auditorium 4B. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the air of the outside world, tasting the exhaust of the city bus and the sweetness of the manicured campus grass. My hands were still shaking slightly. The adrenaline of confrontation takes a long time to metabolize, but my mind was crystal clear. I put my headphones on, sliding the large cups over my ears, creating a sanctuary of sound. I pressed play. The bass kicked in, heavy, distorted, unapologetic. It was the same music she would have called noise, the same rhythm she would have called undisciplined. But here, in the sun, it was fuel. I thought about the essay. I thought about the grade she would have to give me now. She couldn't fail it. To fail it now would be to admit that she simply didn't understand it, and her ego would never allow that. She would give me an A, and she would hate every stroke of the pen as she wrote it. That was the tax she had to pay. I adjusted my backpack, feeling the weight of the books, the weight of the expectation, the weight of being a black man in a world that demands you be twice as good to get half as much. Today, I had been 3 times as good. Today, I hadn't just survived the system, I had hacked it. I walked across the quad, my stride matching the beat in my ears. I wasn't just a student anymore. I was a cartographer of the invisible, just like I wrote. I was mapping a way through. The path was steep, and the gatekeepers were angry, but I had the keys. I had the words. And as long as I had the words, I had the power. I merged into the crowd, just another face to the passers-by. But inside, I was a king returning from a crusade, bloodied but unbowed, carrying the trophy of my own name.